Is violence ever a good thing? Or to put it another way, is violence ever justified? Which is a slightly different way of looking at it. I think many people would say no. Many people would say that violence is never the answer. In fact, that's almost a modern day proverb that violence is never the answer. It's never justified. You may have also heard it said that all war is futile. Nothing good ever comes of war. But a few months ago, I saw a meme that began to challenge some of my assumptions on the subject. I went on something of a journey with this. And in this video, I'm going to perhaps challenge some of your assumptions as well. This is the argument for a just war. And I'm going to start this journey with the story of a bully and a little girl.
When I began my teaching career 30-some years ago, we had a young daughter who was only at the time 4 or 5 years old, and we lived next door to a family that had a son the same age. And this son used to come over and play in the backyard in the sandbox with our daughter, but he was a little bit belligerent and something of a bully. And several days in succession, our daughter came in crying and sniffling and sobbing because the little boy next door had punched her. And we had tried to instruct our daughter not to retaliate in kind and not to return evil for evil. And but this was becoming such a problem that it was getting out of hand. Even when we talked to the parents who sought to restrain their child from this act of bullying other children, it was to no avail. And so I had a conversation with my daughter, and I said, honey, the next time he hits you, try to think of something that might stop him from doing it again. I didn't want to come right out and say, hit him back. But I said, you try to think of something. So the very next day, I hear my daughter wailing and crying and coming in the back door, and I said, what's the matter, honey? And she said, he hit me again. I said, well, what did you do? And she said, I couldn't think of anything to do. So I said, well, let me give you a suggestion. I said, the next time he begins to attack you and starts to hit you, hit him back. And so the very next day, I was in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, I heard this ungodly scream, this wailing coming from the backyard, sounding like the squealing of a stuck pig. And I rushed to the back door and opened it, and I looked out, and I saw my daughter, 4 or 5-year-old daughter, on top of this guy with her fist clenched, and she looks up at me and she said, should I hit him again, Daddy? She learned the principle of self-defense in this little encounter, and actually it was the end of the bullying.
A little girl was being bullied relentlessly. Her father tried to stick to the proverbial modern-day wisdom that violence is never the answer. He tried everything he could to avoid that outcome. But when it really came down to it, after all other options had been exhausted, she punched back and the bullying ended. Violence in that case was the answer, or at least it was an answer, because some might say in that situation, violence could still have been avoided. There could still have been another way to resolve that situation, and they may be right. So imagine this scenario. Imagine you're walking down the street one day and you see a violent offender attacking, assaulting, and raping a woman. And you hear the screams, you hear the commotion, and you rush over there and shout to the offender to stop immediately. But imagine no matter what you say, he just doesn't stop. Imagine there's nothing you can say to make him stop. In that situation, I would suggest that violence then becomes the answer. Quite simply, you need to jump in there and subdue the attacker by any means necessary in order to save that victim. And the same holds true if you saw child abuse or animal abuse. If someone invades your home and threatened your family with a gun, like in this situation, the lives of your family are on the line. Violence then becomes the answer. This man does the right thing. There's no time for negotiation here. You need to fight the intruder off and protect the innocent. You may have seen this story a little while ago where a 6-year-old boy called Bridger Walker saw his little sister being attacked by a dog, and he jumped in there to fight the dog off, saying, "If someone had to die, I thought it should be me." He was left needing 90 stitches, but he saved his little sister's life that day. In that case, violence was the answer. In fact, not only was it the answer, but people rightly called this little boy a hero for what he did. It was heroic to fight that dog off. Apparently he was inspired by superhero movies. He's a fan of Marvel. And that's a good point. Why do we call them superheroes? What's the central characteristic of a superhero? What do you expect to see above all things when you go to watch a superhero movie? You expect to see them fighting evil to protect the innocent. This is why when we see civilians fighting terrorists on the street to save others, we call them heroes. It's why we call the police heroes when they take down thieves and murderers and rapists. It's why we call soldiers heroes when they storm beaches and liberate captives. If violence is never the answer, why do we call these people heroes when they use violence? I would suggest it's because we know there is such a thing as a just violence. If it's to resist evil, if it's defensive, if it's a last resort, if it's to establish peace, if it's to protect the innocent, we know there are times when it's good and right and just and necessary to use violence. This is why some people tweak the old adage and say violence is never the answer unless used against heathens and monsters, or violence is never the answer except when it is sometimes, or violence is never the answer except when it's the only possible response. I think we also have to acknowledge that when people don't step up in these situations and do what's necessary, they can sometimes be considered cowardly. It can be cowardly to run away from someone who's attacking the innocent and not do anything to intervene. You know the old adage that all that evil needs to flourish is for good men to do nothing. Sometimes the good thing they need to do is to fight. Sometimes it falls on good men to use their strength to protect the innocent and to defeat evil and restore peace. Only then can there be security in the land. I think our generation perhaps struggles with these ideas far more than what previous generations did. It seems to me that previous generations saw the use of just physical force in a much more pragmatic way than what we do. Just force was seen as an uncomfortable part of life, a regrettable part of life, and yet a necessary part of life. Whereas now, it seems like we're intent today on trying to imagine and create a society where there's no physical force at all, even just force. So for example, when you see what the police force do to resist evil and to establish peace and protect the innocent, often they're using a just violence. It's violent, but it's a just violence. Policing involves tackling, wrestling, handcuffing, beating, tasering, even shooting people dead. It involves violence, a just violence, but it's violent. Now, many in our society today are squeamish about all forms of violence. Violence is never the answer, including just violence. And I've tried the experiment of trying to run a society without a police force at all. Some cities are looking at softer alternatives. Some are suggesting replacing the police with community officers or community mediators. Some are suggesting self-policing. And of course, a few years ago, many people shouted about defunding the police altogether. However, if you look at what has happened to those places where the experiment has been tried, namely liberal states in the United States, you see the results have been devastating. Crime has shot up to the extent that many businesses have had to leave the area. Evil has abounded and they've become lawless places. There's a type of force, a type of violence which is necessary for subduing evil. Another example of our squeamishness around just force can be seen with child discipline, I think. Again, previous generations understood that physical discipline was an uncomfortable and yet necessary part of raising a child well. And the Bible agrees with this. It says, those who spare the rod of discipline hate their children. Those who love their children care enough to discipline them. Now, parents in the past would take this on board, and they would occasionally spank their children, and teachers as well were given authority to use corporal punishments in school. However, due to our present-day squeamishness, today we're trying to raise kids well without any physical discipline whatsoever through what's become known as gentle parenting. And I do fundamentally believe that that experiment is not working either. In fact, it's so ridiculous, it's easily parodied.
Wait. I am so sorry that I said that it was time to go. How about we start a timer?
No!
Oh, gentle hands. I know you're having so many big feelings right now. Mommy just wants to validate them. Gentle hands. Hands are for gentle. I am not going to cause you any more anxiety than you already have. I can see you're having a hard time not hitting. Do you need my help to stop?
No!
Can you say sorry to Mommy?
No!
Oh, that's right. Sorry is a scary word. Do I have your consent to comfort you? Are you ready to get up right now?
No!
Oh, no. Okay, I'll wait for you to be ready.
You may have seen this video recently where a child is roaming around Walmart, destroying the store, and instead of disciplining the child, one lady starts shouting that nobody must yell at her or touch her because that's not the gentle parenting way. And so everybody stands aside and watches as this child is just left to trash the place. Now, good research has been done on this, and it turns out that children who are not physically disciplined are far more likely to become anxious, depressed, and develop serious problems in adulthood. Kids need boundaries, and lack of discipline is ruining a generation. Perhaps we need to come to terms again and become less squeamish about what needs to happen in order to create happy, healthy people and happy, healthy societies. It's uncomfortable, and yet it's necessary. But if you want to know why our generation is going down this softly, gently route, I did a series a while ago called Trench, which explains exactly why this is happening in the postmodern age. Essentially, we're trying to create a society and build a society that functions well using only what I call the soft virtues, but not the hard virtues. We're rejecting the hard virtues. And the truth is, it just won't work. We need these hard virtues. So go check that series out. Now that we've established, though, that there is such a thing as a just use of physical force, that now leads us to think about war. Is all war futile? Is all war wrong? Is violence never the answer on that national and international scale? Well, this is where I come back to this meme, which started the whole journey for me. And this isn't actually the original meme. I should say that. I couldn't find it, but I've recreated it using AI. It was a picture of a smiling man on a horse. And in the background was this peaceful, rural, idyllic scene. Rolling hills, a farm, some cattle, grazing peacefully in the fields. Just a blissful, tranquil, sunny day. The very picture of contentment. And the caption read, "You have no idea how much violence it took to create something so peaceful." Now, this got me thinking, is it true that if you live in a peaceful, happy, secure part of the world, it was only established and is only being maintained through violence? We've already looked at the police force and how they maintain our peace through just violence on a daily basis at a local level. But I think what this meme is getting at is something bigger. Namely that nations themselves tend to be founded upon violence through revolutions and wars and tend to be protected by wars as well. So I began thinking about this and about how various nations came into existence, and I first began thinking about Old Testament Israel in the Bible and how it established itself in the Promised Land through war, and how God approved of that war and facilitated it by taking down the walls of Jericho, for example, and how God approved of defensive wars thereafter to maintain the peace of Israel, especially against the Amalekites. Invaders would come in, and Israel's warriors had to go to the edges to push them out again. Invaders would come in and the same thing would happen. And I began thinking about how the cities in those days were built within defensive walls to protect the peace of the citizens. Guards would stand at the ramparts and at the gates and would go out to meet enemies at a distance so the people within the city could then remain at peace. And that's a good image to think of as we go through this video. Wars at the edges so the people within can remain at peace. I began thinking about how my own country of Scotland was established by the wars of independence against England, and how generations of Scotsmen frequently had to go to the edges of the kingdom to fight so the people back home could remain at peace. I began to think about the United Kingdom and how this island has been at peace for centuries, but only because of the wars at the edges to keep invaders out like Napoleon or the Nazis or whoever. I began thinking about the United States and how it was established in the violent American Revolution, and how it's been at peace only because the military is fighting its wars at the edges. And through these examples, I had to concede there was something in this meme. Peaceful nations do tend to have been established and maintained by violence at the edges. Now, this is not a new concept. I was in Stockholm recently, and there they have a 17th century warship called the Vasa. Now, while walking around this exhibit, I saw this sign which says, "Peace requires war. War is necessary to protect the country and the true faith," it says. The ancient Romans also had the same idea. They had an adage which says, "If you want peace, prepare for war." If you want peace for your citizens, your enemies must understand you at least have the capability and potential for war. They will think twice about attacking only if they can see that you're prepared, and that becomes the deterrent, which is why nations invest in military spending even when they're at peace. It creates a deterrent, which creates the peace for the citizens. I then got thinking about a quote by Thomas Jefferson, who believed that peace and freedom can never be maintained long-term in a nation without periodic violence to protect it and re-establish it in the land. He said, "What country before ever existed a century and a half without rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." So Thomas Jefferson was of the opinion that due to the sinful nature of mankind, peace and freedom would never be won once and for all time. At best, you could win freedom for your generation and maybe for a few generations to come, but it would never be permanent. It would never be permanent. There would always arise new enemies at your walls and new tyrants from within your walls who would seek to subjugate and oppress the people. And therefore, periodically, there would always be this recurring requirement for patriots to take to the battlefield to confront and fight the tyrants and put them down. In other words, Thomas Jefferson agreed with the meme. It takes a lot of violence to establish peace and freedom in a land. Freedom isn't free, as the old saying goes. Now, this is something that we really have to consider. If you're fortunate enough to be able to live in a peaceful part of the world, isn't it true that at some point in the past, likely at many points in the past, men had to fight and lay down their lives to create that peace for you? Many of us can say that we've never had to commit violence and we never would, but we have the luxury of saying that only because other people have done it for us in the past or are still doing it for us today, namely the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. They're all fighting at the edges, on the walls, so to speak, so that we within the walls can live at peace. George Orwell said, "Those who abjure violence can only do so because others are committing violence on their behalf." Within peaceful societies, you can find pacifists who renounce all forms of violence. But the only reason they have the luxury of renouncing all forms of violence and continuing to live, at least in freedom, is because others are fighting at the perimeter on their behalf. If those at the walls laid down their arms and the invaders came inside the gates, you wouldn't have the luxury of being a pacifist. You would have to fight if you wanted to live, or at least if you didn't want to be ruled by tyrants. See, we may think ourselves noble because we've never committed violence against anyone, but the only reason that we don't have to fight outside our front door is because soldiers and Navy officers and Air Force officers are doing it for us at the edges. People sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. There's also a quote that I found, and I've forgotten where I saw it, and it's annoying me because it perfectly summarizes this idea. I wish I could find it. I think it was from an early Christian writer, and it said something like, "There's no honor in being a pacifist if you intend to profit from the peace that others are fighting to provide. There's no honor in not doing the fighting, but then wanting to benefit from the peace that results from that fighting, wanting the blessing, but not wanting the responsibility," if that makes sense. I wish I could find that quote. So this is all quite depressing, but the bottom line here is that until Jesus returns, because sin exists in the world, there will always be enemies trying to get inside the gates, and there will always arise new tyrants from even within your gates. And so periodically, if you want to live free, men will always have to periodically fight to defend society and reestablish peace and freedom within the land. Now, the question is, if that's true, can we handle that truth? What I mean is, in an age which is softly, gently, struggles with disciplining children, struggles with what policing needs to look like, struggles with all forms of violence and says it's never the answer, can we handle the truth that it might be the answer to creating peace and freedom in our land? And can we come to terms with what would then be required to establish peace and freedom within our land? I'm reminded of this scene from A Few Good Men. Now, I should say I know that Jack Nicholson's character is the bad guy in this movie and he's a terrible person, so this is maybe not the best example to use. But in the speech, he asks that question, and I think we do need to wrestle with it.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth! Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives. And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post.
Again, I know he's the bad guy, so it's perhaps not the best example, but I do think there's something in that speech that we need to reckon with and wrestle with. If it's true that we will always need to periodically defend ourselves from enemies and tyrants, then can we handle the truth of what that would actually need to look like? If we think of World War II Allied soldiers, for example, can we handle the truth of knowing what they had to do to protect our freedom in their day? That's perhaps why men of that generation seemed to not want to talk about the war, because perhaps they thought people wouldn't understand. Yet are we not glad that such men existed and were willing to do what it took and answered the call of duty? Because if they didn't, and if the Army and the Air Force and the Navy don't do it today, then we would have to stand at post and do it ourselves. I'm going to wrap this up by turning to Augustine, a 4th century theologian who was one of the first Christians to codify the just war theory. He said, "We do not seek peace in order to be at war, but we go to war that we may have peace." Augustine believed that war could be regrettably justified under 7 conditions. Firstly, he said, war must be fought for a just cause, such as defending against aggression, punishing injustice, or restoring what was taken by violence. Secondly, war must be declared by a legitimate authority, not by individuals or factions. Thirdly, the intention behind the war must be to promote good and avoid evil, with the ultimate goal being the restoration of peace. Fourthly, war should only be undertaken as a last resort, after all other peaceful means of resolving the conflict have been exhausted. Fifthly, there must be a reasonable chance of success. Throwing people into a pointless and futile battle where there's no hope would just cause unnecessary suffering and death. 6. The means used in war should be proportional and not excessive. And finally, innocent civilians should be protected from harm. These are the guidelines that Augustine put forward for a just war. And what I find interesting about Augustine's guidelines for a just war is that after going through my own thought process, through the Bible and history and movies and considering the police and parenting, etc., I had landed on something approximating Augustine's guidelines. Not exactly, but something in that ballpark. And to this point then, in the journey, It was difficult for me not to reach the conclusion that violence can indeed be just and good and right and necessary. Without it, R.C. Sproul's daughter would have been bullied relentlessly. Violent invaders would get away with it and kill innocent people in their homes. This little girl would have lost her life. Terrorists would have killed endlessly. This kid would have trashed the whole supermarket. All cities would descend into anarchy. Israel would have been persecuted forever by the Amalekites and perhaps never would have been established at all. Scotland would have been conquered and wouldn't have won its freedom. The United Kingdom would have been conquered and wouldn't have won its freedom. The United States would never have won its freedom and independence. Europe would have fallen to the Nazis. Not all war, we have to confess, has been futile. Sometimes the consequences of it have been good. Sometimes it has been necessary. And it was then that I started thinking about the Crusades. Without Christians defending Europe against Islamic invaders about 1,000 years ago, it's possible the world as we know it today just doesn't exist. It's possible that without that defense from Christians against Islamic invaders, Europe would have been conquered and it would be under a kind of dark age under Sharia law today. The United States would have never come into existence, or Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand, because they were offshoots of Europe. Indeed, it may be true that there would be no free land in all the earth today in which to freely practice Christianity. And on that cliffhanger, I'm going to pause and we're going to pick it up in the next one, where we'll start looking at the opposing argument, the argument for pacifism.